I never related enough to fictional characters to really get the appeal of BuzzFeed-style quizzes. The whole concept of enjoying a work of fiction with enough fibers of your being to be like, yeah, I'm not that character or that character, but I'm definitely that character, always struck me as very serial killer levels of vain, and yet every few weeks my social media would inevitably get hit with someone posting the results from these types of quizzes, resulting in my further distancing myself from what I've grown to believe are the acceptable social internet norms. And hey, that's fine. Maybe I just never related to characters in books and TV shows on this level because I was always more interested in the behind-the-scenes process. The artists and writers responsible for crafting these intricate worlds and characters in the first place. Growing up primarily on manga and anime though, there was always this literal and figurative barrier blocking me off from really seeing my creative heroes as more than those mysterious beings that churn out things I think are neat. And even in the case of Western creatives, they'd always end up being some old white guy with some weird hick upbringing I could never relate to. Enter Jean Lewin Yang, a Chinese-American author that makes comics but keeps his day job of being a high school computer science teacher, all while living in the non-bougie part of the Bay Area. Even being well into college by the time I discovered his works, they still spoke to me on such a personal level. His graphic novels were always pretty approachable to all ages, while still being able to carry these heavy themes of identity, picking apart the Asian experience in a way I never really considered outside of some stuffy classroom. American-Born Chinese was his first notable work, but honestly the rest of his comics deserve just as much praise. From picking apart the heavily nuanced relationship between an American child and their immigrant parents to a dramatic retelling of the Boxer Rebellion, and even the continued adventures of Aang and Company, Yang has really made a name for himself, crafting worlds that cover every nook and cranny of the Asian diaspora. Though, as much as I've enjoyed Yang's graphic novels, there's always been a small nook in his archive that I've yet to touch. Okay, those two, but I was more talking about his Superman comics. In his latest graphic novel Dragon Hoops, Yang as a teacher recounts how he slowly warms up to basketball as he tracks his students' rise to fame on the varsity team. The novel does a solid job humanizing not just the team, but the stakes for each game, as well as Yang's own struggles as he figures out what he should write for his next big comic. While Dragon Hoops does a good standalone job as a thrilling, true-to-life sports story, it also serves as a prequel of sorts, as Yang allows himself a chance to explain just how he pivoted from writing comics part-time to finally landing that job writing for the famed DC Comics and the inherent pressures that comes with. Dragon Hoops just came out in 2020, but Yang's first Superman comics came out back in 2015, with the two separate Superman comics following it, so I guess you could say I had a lot in my backlog. Okay, so before I go into Yang's Superman run, I think it's fair to further preface this by establishing my own level of Superman knowledge. While I have dabbled in the handful of Superman comics and other iterations, I think it's still fair to say that I'm not an aficionado by any means of the word, since, well, I just never grew up on American comics in general. To me, floppy comics were always that thing I figured must have been part of some kids' childhoods based on seeing them in cartoons, but I never really had the opportunity to experience them firsthand until much later in life. They were pretty much on par with the Malt Shop and Scooby-Doo, where TV told me it's a thing, but within my own bubble of childhood, it might as well be a work of fiction. Kinda like Superman segue! So with all the well-deserved accolades as well as previous fantasy hero works he's written like the fantastic Avatar The Last Airbender comics and even the underrated Shadow Hero, getting Yang to write for Superman should be an easy dunk, right? Okay, so his run on Superman isn't technically bad, but it definitely is lacking, especially in comparison to his previous works. Like maybe 90% of American superhero comics released on a strict deadline, it's plagued with this need to reference characters and plot points from issues and creative teams I don't want to backtrack to, interrupted by huge, unnecessary crossover events that, in my case, don't even show up in the collected volumes I read, and just overall read less like a story and more like a means to further add to Superman's Wikipedia page. But to be fair, Yang got picked up to write for Superman starting at this particular iteration's issue 40. Maybe if he had the chance to write a story with a clearer arc and starting point, he'd get a better chance to, oh my god, this is so much better. New Superman basically takes everything technical that draws me away from superhero comics and says, nah, you go in the trash. Let me write a story that's actually a story for once, please. Telling the story of China's own Superman, we're introduced to Kong Kenan, a smug, unlikable teenage bully. From the get-go, we know this isn't going to be your typical empowered ethnic hero story, to which I'm stupendously thankful for. Whenever any media attempt to write a main character that isn't a cisgendered white male, there's always a sense that the writers are walking on verbal eggshells, that they need to make the hero as relatable and likable as possible to make up for the years of insert minority here being framed as undesirable villains. And yet not only does Yang saunter in with this kind of unlikable character setup, he basks in it. He writes presents Kong Keenan so matter-of-factly that if he ever does write him to be some kind of Mary Sue, I sure don't see it. Running from 2016 to 2017, these new Superman issues are able to tell its own story without the in-box problem of being bogged down by decades of lore. Yang's main cast of China's Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman are all created by himself and his creative team for these issues, and thus have infinitely more degrees of freedom than your typical DC character with years of set canon to abide by. As such, he's able to tackle his story with a greater sense of confidence that shines considerably brighter than in his previous Superman comics. Throughout the 24-issue arc, Kong Keenan is less troubled that he's living in the shadow of the American Superman and more troubled about literally anything else. Even with Superman making a cameo or two throughout the series, Kong Keenan ultimately exists as his own character, among a considerably different backdrop with cultural scenarios quite literally and thematically distanced from the American Superman that it would be ridiculous to even compare the two. A few issues in, we see Lex Luthor be the one to implant self-doubt about Kong Keenan's identity, only to further drive home the fact that only bigoted asshats bring up this sort of crap in the first place. If anything, New Superman reminds me more of Batman Beyond in that it's able to take a legacy character and pit him in such a vastly different backdrop and scenario that he's able to exist as his own character rather than any offshoot of some pre-existing model. Character beats like Kong trying to figure out why he's specifically chosen as Superman and his family's significance in this tangled web of conspiracy only further drive home these similarities in a way that makes an intriguing read. And while seeing some plot beats like China's Batman coincidentally having these Chinese equivalents to Joker and Bane are a bit too on the nose, the majority of the series stands well on its own, framing the intricacies of justice under the backdrop of China's government and picking apart exactly what that would lead to. So with two very different Superman series under his belt, it would make sense for Yang to work on more series that gravitate towards the latter one, that even he admits was better executed as a whole, right? Well, as long as we're diving into Yang's own words, he's admitted in several interviews that he's a massive Superman fanboy, with Superman and the Atomic Knights being one of his first exposures to comics that made him immediately fall in love with the medium. This is all to say if you're a fan of the Supes, you're not gonna let the one failed attempt make you averse to writing for him forever. Enter Superman Smashes the Klan, a modern retelling of the 1940s radio show about an Asian American family that soon finds themselves wrapped up in some horrible, old-fashioned white supremacy that only Superman himself can stomp out. I will say I'm biased since I feel like I was immediately primed to enjoy the story from the get-go. Not only is it a standalone superhero story written by Gene Yang, but it's illustrated by the creative team of Gurihiru, who also worked alongside Yang on his Avatar run, which, side note, if you're an Avatar fan, you really owe it to yourself to read those. 5 arcs of character-driven sequel perfection. Similar to those Avatar comics, Superman Smashes the Klan is able to lure you in with this very kid-friendly aura only for you to realize that was a scheme all along, that you've been bamboozled with promises of kawaii adventures only to reach the stunning revelation that what you're reading is a biting, unflinching commentary on the slippery slope that is casual racism and the severe, nay, deadly damage such repercussions can have if not remedied. But I mean, who doesn't love that? Yang so perfectly walks the line between serious and wholesome, treating issues of racism with a sense of honesty that never speaks down to its readers, while also making sure not to tackle it with a sense of 100% naivete, which is perfect for a Superman story. People always argue that Superman is an outdated superhero whose morals and sense of justice are far too cheesy to make any kind of compelling story, and yet Yang remedies that almost effortlessly by having the story itself take place in the 40s. With the backdrop of an America of the past, we become more accepting of this inherent cheese that is Superman's unwaveringly selfless acts. The way Superman uses his cape as a sling for Tommy when he breaks his arm, or how later Superman goes up to Roberta and is like, you know what, just keep the cape, my mom made me like a million of these. Just works, because at this point we're not caught up in the minutia of how someone can be that nice. We're just relieved someone like that can still exist in a time that's otherwise filled with so much bigotry and hate. One of the worst things you can do in a story centralized about race is to oversimplify the issue to only bad people are racist, and yet Yang expertly navigates this conversation, not just during the comic's climax, but consistently throughout the story. He perfectly encapsulates the minority experience of racism, not coming out in these big shows of hatred, but through these more low-key instances that you just let slide because you got places to be. And yet it's through all these tinier instances that eventually something more sinister accumulates, and it's only during these times that the public shows their concern. Are we sure this isn't a modern Superman story? In addition to these bigger titles under DC, Yang has also done a couple one-shot stories for them, with new series Shang-Chi having just come out at the time of this video's posting. He's an incredibly talented writer both in and outside of the world of mainstream superhero comics, and to me as a fellow Asian American, this is important. With this new wave of inclusion in media, I'm seeing more people push for main characters of color without considering that those voices are still written and directed by a majority white team. And while it's a nice start to have POC characters in prominent roles story-wise, opening up what and how these stories are told not only allows for more variety, but gives people of color a sense of validation. that their opinion and stories matter without any need for white people to have to vouch for them. It's a breath of fresh air to not just have an Asian American writer, but one so thoroughly accomplished to be able to thrive regardless of what publishers he's under. It's so easy for established creators to coop themselves into a world that they're used to, so for Yang to be able to shift focus so many times throughout each of his graphic novels not only tells something about his level of skill, but the number of different audiences that are able to closely relate to what he has to say. Each of his stories, as different as they may be, provide insight that validates the Asian American experience in a way that I hope non-Asians are able to enjoy just as much. Just please don't make a BuzzFeed quiz about which Gene Yang character I am because I won't take it.